Hare Krishna. Welcome to another episode in Lives of the Vaishnavacharyas. I'm your host, Chaturatma Das, as usual, and happy to be here. First thing, of course, is just to get a little input from the chat room that the sound and picture's coming through nice. If it's too dark or too light or too loud or too soft or whatever. Manjesh and Bhakti and Carol are both in there. If you could just give me a little great picture and great sound. Good. Well, we'll get ready to go. Tonight, we have a lot of ground to cover. I have to, before we get too far into this, thank my good friend and dear godbrother Dhruva Maharaj Das for giving me some last-minute inspiration and enthusiasm. Sometimes I'm like a boat in the ocean without a rudder, and having a godbrother come along and kind of set your course straight really helps out. So I'm very indebted to him. There's so much that we could be dealing with tonight. Today, of course, is we've got Ganga Puja, Baladeva Vidyabhusana, Ganga Mata Goswamini. Tomorrow is Pandava and Nirjala Ekadasi, and what to do. Last year we spoke in depth about Ganga Mata Goswamini, and I wanted to just briefly touch the other two subjects, namely Ganga Puja. Today is a very, very important day for bathing in the Ganga, for getting the mercy of Mother Ganges. One can read in the Srimad Bhagavatam the story of the Ganga's descent, and one can chant the mantra for calling the Ganga into water and take bath in the Ganga today. It's a very, very important day. There's still a few hours left in the day, so you can do that before you go to bed tonight. Tomorrow, of course, is Pandava and Nirjala Ekadasi. There is a bit of debate going on in some camps, but from everything I have read and everything I have conferred with other senior devotees, it's very clearly noted in the Brahma Vaivarta Purana and in the Hari Bhakti Vilas that if one observes the Ekadasi on this day, tomorrow, Pandava Nirjala, by complete fasting, one reaps the benefit of all Ekadasis in the course of the year. Now, the debate seems to center around whether that means that if you broke Ekadasi you get the benefit or not. That I can't speak on. It's not that clear in the verse, and I'm not a scholar by any means, but it is clear that tomorrow is a very, very potent day for fasting. It should be noted that this should be done only in conjunction with one's ability to do so according to one's A, service, and B, health. If one is of ill health or poor health or questionable health, they shouldn't do such things as this. If one has a very important service, a very demanding service, that this would take away from being able to do that, then of course one shouldn't do it. So one has to be practical. As Prabhupada said in one letter, use your common sense, and if you don't have any, ask somebody that does. I love that letter, one of my favorites from Prabhupada. Use your common sense, and if you don't have any, ask somebody that does. So, who does that leave? That leaves Baladeva Vidyabhusana. And I really wanted to speak a bit about his life today. It's quite an in-depth story, and there's a lot of ground to cover. So we're going to forego my usual formalities of reminding all of you to support Krishna.com and all their good work here, and going on to all the incredible stories from the installation of Radhasham Sundar, of the installation here at Radhasham Sundar Mandir of Krishna and Balaram, and we're going to dive right in to the life of Baladeva Vidyabhusana. So Baladeva Vidyabhusana, of course, very, very highly renounced, pure devotee, who does not even, you were not even able to find a fraction of the desire for name and fame. Many of us, we have that desire for name, for fame, for profit, adoration, distinction like that. These qualities were completely missing from him. He, of course, compiled many, many different literatures, and the fact of the matter is that there's very little information about his early birth, his exact place of birth, the time that he appeared, and things like that. Some historians, most historians, have noted that he was born sometime in the early to middle 18th century. In probably, most definitely in Orissa, and probably near the village of Ramuna. So I think just for a moment, let's kind of put our mind at ease and picture the following scenario descriptively of that time period in the state of Orissa. You would hear, as the sun's coming up in the morning, the sound of wonderful voices, and it's a local village school. The boys are all seated in a nice row with their palm leaf manuscripts in front of them, learning all their lessons, committing them to memory, chanting the different rules of grammar, reciting their rhetoric lessons, discussing the different aphorisms of their logic, each boy chanting loudly enough to be heard over the boy next to him. And as a result, young boys, you have a very high-pitched sound of beautiful voices. So this school was attended by Baladeva Vidyabhusana during the 18th century, and it resembled many of the village schools that existed and have existed in India for thousands and thousands of years. The system of the Gurukula has endured in its effective way, producing brilliant, disciplined scholars, especially at that time, and Baladev was among those. Now, before going to the school, he was the son of a merchant, and he lived for several years, as I mentioned, in a village near Ramuna. And he then studied with a group of different pundits and scholars that were in the area at that time. And you could just imagine the lush countryside of Orissa. Those of you that have been there, some of you in our listening audience may even live there from time to time. Fertile fields there, and thus it provided very wonderful and abundant and ample fruits and vegetables and grains for very, very wholesome diet. So in this environment, these boys studied very hard, played very hard. They grew, they learned, and they were very discerning in their tastes of what to do and what not to do. Just a quick side note, one of our guests in the chat room is asking if this is being recorded, and yes, it is. It will be posted somewhere later if you're not getting it live. So, as Baladev graduated from the school, he did not want to return home to his father's shopkeeping. He had other interests. He actually wanted to be a teacher, not just an ordinary pundit, but a true acharya, one who would be able to teach others the divine knowledge of spiritual wisdom, one who had mastered all logic and philosophy and medicine and cosmology and all of these things, and even more, an acharya who knew all the deepest secrets of the Shastras, of the scriptures, and could impart them to others. So with this in mind, he decided to take an in-depth study of philosophy and theology. He decided he would become a Vedantist, an authority on the ancient Vedic books of knowledge. And he couldn't think of any greater way that he could benefit himself and others by taking up this path. So very, very noble thoughts. So he decided he would look for a teacher, for a guru. So in this way, he went on pilgrimage to all the different tirthas, the holy places of India. He met many different monks and scholars and pundits and saints. And he went to Mysore in South India, a place known as Karnataka, southwest part of India. And there he came upon a hermitage of different holy men. And they were followers of the renowned scholar and great saintly person, Ananda Tirtha, who had formerly been known as Madhvacharya. Excuse me. So there in this monastery, he studied under the science of Vedantic thought and the philosophy of the Vedas, and mastered all these things. He became very expert in understanding and acknowledging everything. And these are talents that would serve him well in the challenges that were to come to him in his later years as a young man. Challenges that, we might add, were critically important to the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism and to the very line of teachings which comes to our present-day Krishna consciousness movement. I want to welcome Radha Krishna Devi Dasi. our great cook from Montreal. Nice to have her back. So, leaving South India, Baladeva Vidyabhusana began to travel. And in his travels, he returned to Orissa, where he met a grand disciple of Rasikananda Dev, Radha Damodar. Sri Radha Damodar Dev was his name. And he met with him and discussed philosophy and different types of teachings and everything that were coming from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And he was requested by Radha Damodar to please take up the teachings of Mahaprabhu. And these talks with him penetrated into the heart of Baladeva Vidyabhusana and awakened a certain love within him. So after a few days of discussions, he surrendered and was initiated by Radha Damodar into the Radha Krishna mantra and brought into the disciplic succession coming from Lord Nityananda. This line, actually, Lord Nityananda to Gauridas Pandit, to Hriday Chaitanya, all personalities you've heard speak of very well in our classes, to Shamananda Prabhu, from Shamananda Prabhu to Rasikananda Dev, from Rasikananda Dev to Nayananda Goswami, from Nayananda Goswami to Sri Radha Damodar Goswami, and from Radha Damodar Goswami now to Baladeva Vidyabhusana. So in this way he was connected in a very secure, authentic line. So in a very short time of study, he became quite expert in the Gaudiya Vaishnava theology, understanding all of the subtleties and understanding all of the details. And with the permission and blessings of his guru, he then left from Orissa and went to Vrindavan. He wanted to further his studies, particularly under the tutelage of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, who was residing there in Vrindavan. Now, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur was very, very gratified that Baladev came to study him, particularly that he came to study the Srimad Bhagavatam, and he suggested the suitable day that it would be proper to start the studies on. This is kind of noteworthy that, as I mentioned earlier, that he was knowledgeable in astrology and cosmology, and they understood the movements of the planets and the presence and influence of demigods and non-demigods, and they could pick these proper times. And so, in this manner, they picked the proper time. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur did for the beginning of the education of Baladeva Vidyabhusana. And he also decided, this boy Baladeva is very special. He should also study different rasa texts that were advanced in the process of devotional service. And he had a local scholar, Pritam Bardas, work with him and teach him some of these sciences. So, Baladev's appetite had already been whetted by reading Jiva Goswami's Bhagavat Samdarbha when he was in Puri under Radha Damodar Goswami. And so, from the instructions of Vishwanath Chakravarti and the teachings of Pritam Bardas, he became very well learned, very knowledgeable in the esoteric meanings of the Bhagavat philosophy, all the different levels of rasa tattvas, and of course, studying the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Krishnadas Kaviraj's stories of the lifetime of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So in this way, he very, very deeply immersed himself. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur was extremely pleased to not only see his vast taste for learning, but the humble and gentle nature of his character and his desire for renunciation and his ability to master all of the different schools of Vedic knowledge. So he continued, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, to instruct him in the philosophy of Achinta Bheda Bheda Tattva. And carefully, Baladeva Vidyabhusana listened and grasped all of these teachings. So I think it's nice if we take a little bit of a look at Vrindavan at this time, where Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur was living. During the time that Baladeva Vidyabhusana was born, the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, the followers of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, were very well established in Vrindavan. And this was a wonderful time for them. Lord Chaitanya had recently discovered many of the different holy places, and there was a rejuvenation of the deities and temples that were long associated with Vrindavan, the different holy places. But life in that time period was often insecure as well. We see that for thousands of years, Vrindavan and Mathura had periodically been invaded or pillaged by foreigners, by other countries. And but somehow or another, despite all these calamities, the region of Mathura, the city of Vrindavan, had thrived as a center for trade and culture. And every one of the ancient religions considered Mathura to be an important place of study, an important place of residence. So it had always been a holy place, but under Mahaprabhu, these things blossomed greatly. For a powerful rebirth of the importance and religious significance of Vrindavan, this all took place. And the different gurus at that time and the temples that were established, even up to the point after Mahaprabhu to the arrival of Baladeva Vidyabhusana in the 18th century. Now, unfortunately, as we mentioned, there were always some calamities. The peaceful leadership and peaceful enjoyment of Vrindavan Dham was not to last. In 1669, the Mughal ruler Aurangzeb, I always say his name wrong, you have to forgive me, Aurangzeb, he decreed from his post that all of the Hindu temples and the carved deities, the images, which are completely opposed to his understanding of religious theology, must be destroyed. And so in this way, the deities, the priests, the pilgrims of Vrindavan, they were all in great danger. And the faithful devotees, they would stop visiting Vrindavan once it became known that, there was great pillaging going on, and the pilgrims are being accosted and tortured, and there were many difficulties. Some were being beaten, some were even being killed just because of their faith and the philosophy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and the Vaishnava way of life. So the Vaishnava priest there, they pleaded to the different Hindu kings in the region that you must give us protection, you must take care of the deities, particularly those Hindu rulers in Rajasthan. So at that time, this protection was guaranteed, and gradually some of the deities made their way to the Rajasthan area, to the city of Amber, which is the old name of the city of current Jaipur. So, but you can imagine Vrindavan without deities, without brahmanas, without the pilgrims. It lost much of its old glory. Now, one of the principal deities of Vrindavan at that time was Govinda. Govinda was 24-inch, beautiful black marble image of Sri Krishna in his original aspect as a cowherd boy. Now, Srila Rupa Goswami had excavated him during the search of the holy places as being instructed by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And later on, as the Aurangzeb's, my dear friend Durmars is trying to help me get this pronunciation right. Anyway, Aurangzeb's armies, they came to demolish all the different temples and deities, and particularly the splendid beauty of the 7-story tall temple of Govindaji. And so at that time, the priests secretly moved the deity to Radhakund. And in this way, they hid the deity in the Radhakund area. So after staying at Radhakund for 1 year, the priests then transferred the deities to Kaman, which is a city, a fortified city, if you will, kind of in the Mathura district. A suitable place for Govindaji was made there, and the deity stayed there for some time. It mentions historically that for more than 30 years, he and 2 other deities from Vrindavan, Gopinath and Madan Mohan, resided there. But the problem was that most of the pilgrims avoided going there. It was very out of the way, difficult place to get to. And there was a local people called the Jats who had this constant battle going on with the Mughals. They actually had risen up to try and fight against the Mughals. So it was a bit of an area of sorts. Excuse me, the picture just went out and I thought we were lost there. Okay. It was a bit of a war zone of sorts between the Mughals and the Jats, and the deities were protected there, but the pilgrims couldn't come so much. So, thus in this way, the different kings of Jaipur, the great Rajputs, they found themselves kind of in a, how would you say, in a pivot point between these two groups, the Mughals and the Jat guerrillas, so to speak, you know. So, of course, the kings, they allied themselves with the Mughals because they didn't want to take sides with the less powerful Jats. But at the same time, they were patrons of all the Vrindavan deities who the Mughals were setting out to destroy. So it was a very awkward something for them. That hum that is being heard. I'm going to step off camera just for a moment and close the door. I think it's a machine on the outside of the room. Give me just a moment. I don't think that actually helped much, but at any rate, you can let me know if it has. So, one of the great kings, Maharaj Singh, who was the king of Amber of Jaipur, he ordered that in 1671 Govinda should be transferred from Kaman to Kaman, which was under the jurisdiction of the kings there, of the Rajputs at that time. And this transfer, as I mentioned, was meant to be temporary, with the idea that once all the political turmoil resolved, that Govindaji would then go back to Vrindavan. But, as we all know, the Lord has his own plans. And the Lord moves according to his mysterious ways. And after 30-something years staying there, he did make another trip, but this time to Amber, or the current-day Jaipur. So, now Govinda's home in Jaipur was much different than the amazing mood in the forest of Vrindavan. He lived so grandly and opulently. You know, Vrindavan's the main Vaishnava holy place. He was the unchallenged supreme personality of Godhead of Vrindavan. Everyone worshipped him, and all the temples, his priests, you know, they were coming, all the worshippers were coming in the line of Rupa Goswami, and they were the acknowledged leadership there in Vrindavan. And there was no challenge to their authority or to their philosophy. And the practice of bhakti, the practice of devotional service to Lord Krishna, was the way of life for everyone. However, in the city of Amber, not all the Vaishnavas worship Lord Krishna in this way. There was one devotee of Lord Ramchandra. His name was Payahari Krishnadas. And he had settled in one town called Gulta, which is just a bit outside of Amber or Jaipur. Very, very beautiful place. If you ever get a chance to go to the city of Jaipur, you should definitely take a side trip to Gulta. As you'll hear, it has very great historical reference to our own line, but it's got beautiful waterfalls and bathing tanks and just up in the mountains, very nice. I should let you know in advance, there are hundreds upon hundreds of monkeys, but they're not quite like the Vrindavan monkeys, so troublesome, but they're everywhere. It's a very beautiful and quiet and nice place. Wonderful waterfalls. So, at any rate, in this place, this valley city, if you will, Payahari, he was the grand disciple of Ramananda. He was a great Indian reformer in South India. He was a follower of Ramanuja. And so Payahari, he worshipped Sitaram, following in the line of Ramachandra, not Radha and Krishna. And so he settled in a cave there in the area of the Golta Valley and made his residence there. And he converted the queen to following Ramanadi Vaishnavism, the Sri Vaishnava line. And she, in turn, converted her husband, which sometimes we see is the case. And they sponsored a Sri Ramanuja monastery or temple there in the Golta Valley. And this became the headquarters for the Ramanuja sect in that part of India. So for 6 generations, the Ramanadis, they, the temple leaders there, they enjoyed a pretty much privileged position in the court of the king. And, they were undisputed. But with the arrival of Govindaji into Amber and his vast popularity with the family, of the royal family, they felt that this may be a challenge to their superior position. So, now to Jai Singh, the king, the arrival of Govindaji had very, very important significance because he was a Vaishnava by initiation, by training, by desire, by his heart. And, he studied all the different scriptures. And despite there being so many different Hindu sects within his kingdom, and despite his own royal obligations to maintain Vedic and Puranic rituals and sacrifices, the, Ramadi priests, they had a very strong prominence there, and they're part of the Vaishnava line. So ultimately, though, he was a devotee of Govindaji. This was his heart. And so with the arrival of Govinda in his kingdom, he considered this to be one of the high points in his spiritual quest in life. Wonderful, wonderful. He was so happy. So the Ramadi priest, they understood that, something's going to be a problem here. That, Govindaji's favored by the king. He's his favorite deity. And then the Gaudiya priests, they'll start to develop some religious authority here. And what's going to become of our position? So, certain members of the Sri Sampradaya began to raise various arguments in the court of the king of Jaipur. This was where, when you had some dispute, it was brought before the king, and it was settled by him. So these Ramanadi priests, they brought this dispute. Excuse me. They brought this dispute forward. That, the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, they have no proper commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. They are not, therefore, qualified to worship the deity, and therefore, the worship they're performing should be turned over to the Sri Sampradaya. More importantly, in addition, they objected to the worship of Radha and Krishna, along with the deities of Govinda, of Radharani particularly, along with the deity of Govinda and Gopinath, because they say it was not authorized anywhere in the Shastras. They pointed out that the Gaudiyas should not be worshipping Radha and Krishna together. Radha and Krishna are not married. There is no precedent for them being worshipped together. Sita and Ram, they are together as husband and wife. Lakshmi Narayan, they are together as husband and wife because they are all married. But Radha and Krishna, they are not married. Therefore, it is not proper to sanction this highly immoral relationship. So, this is like fight talk. The Ramanadis, they were escalating this into the highest level of a quarrel. They not only began by criticizing the Gaudiya's lineage, but then they actually began to criticize their process of worship. So, at this point, it seems like a good time to insert a couple of points about this school of thought that will come to pass here. The word Vedanta, we know it consists of 2 words. Veda and Anta. It means the end of knowledge. So Vedanta indicates that one who knows Vedanta knows the end of all knowledge. It's a culmination. The Vedantas are a culmination of all Vedic learning, of all Vedic teaching. The Vedas, of course, being the oldest of the Sanskrit writings, and being compiled directly by the personality of Godhead himself, Srila Vyasadeva. So Vyasadeva later also compiled the Vedanta Sutra. And this contains the different codes or verses, if you will, that are the essence of the various Upanishads, the different hymns that glorify the teachings of the Vedas. Now, because the Vedanta is written in aphorisms and in, almost puzzles, one might say, it's sometimes difficult to understand it. Therefore, a commentary is needed. Now, the oldest and most famous of these commentaries is by Sankaracharya. And Sankaracharya, of course, we know, is a monist. And he believed that the ultimate oneness of the jiva and God was the goal of these teachings. And this is how he interpreted the Vedanta Sutra. Now, of course, after Shankara, the four Vaishnavacharyas came forward, and over the course of several hundred years, they began to write down Vaishnava Vedanta Sutra commentaries. And these Vaishnavas wrote these commentaries down to establish the duality, not the oneness, but the duality of living entity, jiva, and of Krishna, Supreme Personality of Godhead, and thus to refute the monastic teachings of Sankaracharya. So these four great preceptors, Sri Ramanuja, Sri Nimbarka, Sri Madhvacharya, and Sri Vishnu Swami. If you go to the Gaudiya Math Temple of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati in Sri Mayapur Dham, around the temple, at each of the four corners are deities of these four great acharyas. So, as a result, all your religious schools of thought, all of your religious leaders belong to one of these four sampradayas, one of these four lines of teachings. And this is how they're considered to be legitimate. If they're not following in this way, then they're not considered legitimate. Now, the Ramananda line of teaching was coming in the line of Ramanujacharya. So now, we'll recall again that during his early studies, Baladeva Vidyabhusana was there at the temples in South India, studying at the Math of Madhvacharya, and studied the Vedanta Sutra commentary of Madhvacharya. He enjoyed his education there, was very learned, but more than that, he enjoyed the application of the knowledge that he had gained. And he was exhilarated by debates and challenges, and nothing was considered off limits for him. Any high-ranking personality or well-known philosopher, he just would jump at the chance for debates like this. He was very eager for this opportunity to continue to enlighten others with the knowledge he had gained from his teachers. Excuse me. So, after becoming such a skilled lecturer and debater, he, as we said previously, left Mysore and returned to Puri, Orissa area, and then eventually went to Vrindavan. So, back to Amber, or the city of Jaipur. Now, the king we mentioned was initiated in the Gaudiya Sampradaya. So, as the Ramanadi priests were beginning to raise issue with the Gaudiyas and challenge them, he felt something needed to be done. So he sent a letter to the local Gaudiya Mahants, the temple managers, said, look, we need to deal with this. Of course, he had to do this a little quietly. He couldn't be seen as favoring one or the other, but this was where his heart was. So he sent also into Vrindavan, he sent this messages of what was going on in Jaipur and the difficulties there. And so, at the same time, however, because he was the ruling king, and this was a case brought before him, he had to act neutrally until it was resolved. So to this end, he had Radharani removed from the altar and put into a separate room, as the Ramanadi priest had demanded, requested, and he had to restrict the Bengali Vaishnavas from doing worship in the temple until their lineage was cleared up. So, very, very difficult circumstance, to say the least. Now, the Gaudiya Acharyas, they explained on behalf of the entire Gaudiya school of thought to the king, to the Ramanadis, that Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is the Supreme Personality of Godhead himself. And his mission in coming to this world was to flood the entire world with Krishna Prema, love of God. And he wasn't interested in the study of different Vedantic schools of thought or different commentaries. And, he considered Bhagavad Purana, the Srimad Bhagavatam, to be the ultimate commentary. And that Vyas, the author, to be the natural commentator. So, from the Bhagavatam, and by his own example, he taught that one must serve the Supreme Personality of Godhead and absorb oneself in the process of hearing and chanting the holy names. And as a result, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, always absorbed in Krishna Prema and always engaged in kirtan and chanting, had no time for writing anything. This was their presentation. The Ramanadis did not accept this. They were not willing to accept just that simple explanation. So, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu being the Supreme Personality of Godhead and that his sampradaya was beyond doubt, this was not open to them. So they instead insisted on a particular, sampradaya history. That there's only 4 sampradayas. That the Gaudiyas have, by this admission of Mahaprabhu, constituted a 5th sampradaya. And this wasn't acceptable. Therefore, they didn't want to take part in this. So, the king, he could see that, there's a great religious confrontation about to take place. And this was just what was on the horizon. Now the color's gone down in here.
Well, brightness?
Yeah.
It's probably because it's saving battery.
All right, okay. We're going to enter into another phase here, but before I do, I'd like to point out to you that due to a particular technical glitch, it's kind of likely that we're not going to get everything finished here tonight. I'm going to kind of push along at a nice pace, but if the screen suddenly goes dead, don't try and figure out what your connection did wrong. It's from our end, a technical thing. So we're going to push back through. Now, let's imagine during this time in Vrindavan, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is residing there. He's a great scholar, very well known, very well educated. He was born into a Bengali village around the early part of the 1600s and spent the first years of his life there, very, happily pursuing devotional service. Like many of the other aspiring renunciates at that time, he faced problems with his family. They betrothed him at an early age to tie the knot of domestic life, if you will. And as a young married man, Vishwanath studied extensively different shastras and different religious teachings. And while living with his family there, he wrote many brilliant commentaries on the various Vaishnava scriptures. Now, during his life, he took initiation from Radharaman Chakravarti and studied the Srimad Bhagavatam from him and from the other Vaishnavas who were there at that time. Radharaman's father, Krishna Charana Chakravarti. These are devotees that were just 3 generations separated from Narottam Das Thakur. So eventually, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he left his family and went to Vrindavan to take up fully the process of devotional service as a complete renunciate. And he lived there at Radhakund in a very simple and austere way. At that time, he formally accepted the sannyas dress, or the dress of a renunciate, and he began to very, very devotedly write and study and preach. And eventually, through all of this, he became the leader of the Gaudiya community in Vrindavan at that time. So by the time Govinda had moved to Rajasthan, Vishwanath Chakravarti himself was, well, he must have been more than 60 years old. So he was a very aging scholar, but with great interest he was observing the developments going on in Amber, in Jaipur. The challenge by the Ramanadis, the responses by the Gaudiyas, and this didn't just happen over a course of 2 or 3 days. This developed over great periods of time. We just got a note in the chat room here. Go overtime. Hockey does it. Why not Krishna Katha? My dear Radha Krishna Devi Dasi, it's not a question of desire. It's a question of facility. At any rate, we'll finish up here. So, at any rate, by the time that Govindaji moved there, he was quite elderly. So he's observing all this from a distance. And he was wondering, how will Govindaji himself, what to speak of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas there, fare in this conflicted environment, in the very vortex of argument between the Ramanadis and the king's devotion, and at the same time the threatening presence of all the different sects there? How will this turn out? So regularly he was communicating with the Vaishnavas and the Mahants of the different Vaishnava temples there, information going back and forth. And they had already been expecting trouble from the Ramanadi Sampradaya, from the followers, and this quarrel had been stewing for quite some number of years. And now it appeared that the antagonism had grown to full-blown, debate. So Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur called for his disciple Baladeva, Vidyabhusana, who was residing there in Vrindavan, as we mentioned, studying under him with Pitambar Das, like that. And he said, we must refute the points of the Ramanadis. And Vishwanath told his protege, he said, it will not be easy, but if we plan, we can defeat them. Now Baladeva is a little young. He became very outraged at the presumption that the Ramanadis would criticize the Gaudiya teachings in the line of Mahaprabhu and the worship of Radha and Krishna. And he said, we must do something to establish our lineage. And he said, how is it the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna himself, as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, established the true religion in the age of quarrel, yet here we have these personalities that are debating it? The Ramanadis actually question it? And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur confirmed, yes, they are. So the two of them, they stayed up all night discussing the different sides of the debate and the pros and the cons and the different aspects of it, and planning out strategy and counter arguments and philosophical presentations like this. They developed a strategy, like a game plan, speaking of hockey, like a game plan of how they will attack the opposing elements, so to speak. So now at this point, as I mentioned, Vishwanath Chakravarti Pad was very, very old, 67 years old. So there was no question of him going. There was no question of him making this journey. It wasn't like just hopping on a jet plane and a little bit of discomfort, sitting in a seat for a while and then go boom. No, it wasn't like that at all. So in this way, in his place, he sent to Jaipur Baladeva Vidyabhusana, a young man, fully conversant in all the Shastras and completely competent to face the challenge that lay before the very school of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So Baladev's arrival there was very, very unheralded. I mean, he was new to the Gaudiya community. He was unknown even amongst the Gaudiya Mahants in Amber. They didn't really know. They might have heard of him, but they didn't really know, who is this young man? And he was young. It was not the tradition that a young, to use the word upstart, would come and correct everything like that. So, no one even in his own tradition suspected that there was a philosophical giant just waiting inside the frame of this young Vaishnava. So Baladev, had difficulty gaining an audience to listen to what he was going to say. He was just very quickly dismissed in this way. And when he was finally able to do so, the Ramanadis, they were completely ready for him. They were ready for a challenge, and they saw this young kid, and they figured, we got it made here. So, Baladev addressed the king. He said, my dear sir, he said, I have come to resolve the doubts about the Gaudiya Sampradaya and our methods of worship. And the Ramanati Pandits broke in, Your Highness, we request to speak to this young man immediately and directly ourselves. So the king turned to Baladeva and said, Yes, you may speak. And the king was confident that if Krishna, who is indeed the Supreme Personality of Godhead, wanted to, he could arrange for the defense of the Vaishnavas through this young boy. Oh, it's back. Okay, good. The camera went up and down there. All right. So, the Ramanatis, they openly took the offensive right off the bat because they felt sure they were guaranteed the authority in this position. So, the problem, they said to Baladeva, is that you do not belong to a proper sampradaya. Therefore, we cannot accept any literature written by your pundits. And Baladeva asserted with great confidence, Excuse me, I belong to the Madhva Sampradaya. He said, I've been initiated in Mysore by the Tirtha of the Madhva order. They were, quite surprised by this. Then he added, but Radha Damodar Goswami and Vishwanath Chakravarti Goswamis are also my gurus. They have taught me the Bhagavat philosophy. Therefore, I am knowledgeable in both schools and coming in the Madhva Sampradaya. So the Ramanis were very surprised by this. And Baladeva Vidyabhusana's Madhva initiation meant that they had to accept him as a qualified sannyasi and as a pandit of the authorized lineage that they were saying it's only these four. Oh, you're one of these four. Oh, well, all right then. So now they had to accept what he was saying. They said, well, you may be from the Madhva Sampradaya, but the other Gaudiyas here, they're not. So Baladev then, he retained his dignity while being challenged in this very offensive manner, and he produced a key piece of evidence, and that was the Gonadesha Tipika, written by Kavi Karnapur some 150 years ago. And the manuscript deals with the lineage of Madhva all the way up to the Gaudiyas. So Baladev presented this manuscript for inspection by the Ramanati priests. So in this way, the argument continued on. At any rate, so they requested that you have some commentary on the Vedanta Sutra, and we want to see this commentary. So he keeps freezing here, they're saying. Anyway, it's not much we can do. So they requested that he make his commentary, and Baladeva Vidyabhusana said, I can get the commentary for you, but it will take me 7 days. They said, well, where will you go and get it in 7 days' time? He said, I will write it. And they were shocked. You will write? He says, it is there. I'll simply put it into the written form for you within 7 days. So the pundits agreed. So at that time, Baladeva Vidyabhusana went to the temple of Govindaji, went to the temple mandir, and he prayed before the deity. He said, my dear Govinda, your devotee Vishwanath has sent me here to defend you and your devotees, but I cannot do it. I am just a fallen soul submerged in the ocean of ignorance. If you wish, you can empower me to write a Vedanta Sutra commentary that will glorify you. If you wish, I shall write the truths I have learned from your devotees and your scripture. And I have faith that by your mercy, these truths will be most logical. So then, requesting the blessings of Govindaji, he began. And he started off, may he who is so mercifully and munificently kind towards me and bestowed his favor by ordering me in a dream to write down his own commentary, which he would compose, and which attained such renown amongst the, and which would attain such renown amongst the learned circles, please be there to bless me. May that dear friend of Srimati Radharani, who holds him dearer than his own life, be glorified. So he began to write. Practically, he didn't rest the entire time. He wrote day and night, never pausing, just continually writing. And days and nights passed and he did not stop. Finally, he finished his work and he returned to Govindapur. Now, by now, the keen expectation had been aroused by everyone. All the different parties, all the different sects were all curious to see what this young boy was going to come up with. And Jai Singh was hoping to see the Gaudiyas would be vindicated. And he was especially eager to see what is the commentary that's going to be presented. So the Ramanadis, however, they awaited the commentary with trepidation. They were quite frankly hoping this would be an easy one for us to defeat. So Baladeva entered the court and the debate convened in Galta, this most beautiful valley place which I described earlier. He stood on one side with the Gaudiya Mahants, and facing them on the other side were the Ramanadi Pandits, and King Jai Singh presided over the whole thing. And there was an audience of noblemen and of scholars and pundits, and everyone was there. And so, with the king's permission, Baladeva rose and began his work. This commentary, he said, putting forward his work, is based on Madhvas, but there are some important differences. If you examine it, you will find that it upholds the Gaudiya philosophy taught by Lord Chaitanya. Now, at that point, a Ramanadi priest interrupted, already getting a little offensive, interrupted and received permission to speak, and he said, "Who is the author of this work?" And Baladev said, "The name of the commentary is the Govinda Bhasya. Govinda has inspired this work. I have given the direct meaning of the sutras according to the wish of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and my comments are based on the teachings of my gurus." So, the pundits and the learned scholars of the Ramanadi school, they examined the first portion of the Bhasya to determine if it was as Baladeva claimed it to be. And their spokesman concluded that the influence of Madhva is certainly found here in this commentary. So we should examine it further to see what else is available. So Baladeva Vidyabhusana then addressed each and every one of the Ramanadi's objections to the Gaudiya worship. He said, "I have expounded every aspect of Gaudiya practice in the chapter 3. Since your criticisms concern our style of worship, you should turn immediately to chapter 3 and see how Vyasadeva, the author of Vedanta Sutra, has approved of this worship." He then challenged them. He said, "You object to our worship of Radha and Krishna only on the superficial grounds that they are not married. In verses 40 through 42, I have presented the true position of Radha's relationship with Krishna. Radha is the eternal energy of Krishna and is therefore never separated from him. Their relation may be parakya or svakya, but that does not affect the eternal nature of their relationship." So he points out the external, so to speak, Vrindavan relationship cannot be understood as the true meaning of the relationship between Radha and Krishna. So in this way, the separation of Radha and Govinda that you have effected is artificial and is more offensive to the Lord than anything that you're protesting against. Because the Lord holds a great deep affection for his feminine energy. So he continued, "You have criticized our process of worshiping at the presenting of your worship of Krishna only, and that therefore we have neglected the worship of Narayana, or Lord Vishnu, which you say is mandatory for one who is a Vaishnava, a devotee of Vishnu. I've addressed this point in verse 43. So not only is he given a great commentary, but he's arguing all the points and referring to his own commentary. You've got it in your hand. Look at this verse. Look at that verse. No, turn to that chapter. Now look at that. He's got it all down very clearly. So, according to the Vedanta Sutra, Narayana may be worshipped in any of his forms, including Krishna. No scriptural injunction prohibits the worship of Govinda exclusive of Narayana. So Baladeva continues. He's on a roll. He's got all their arguments. He's battling them off one right after the other. And the Ramanis are just standing there defenseless. He's just like he's taking them down one right after the next. So he spoke with great eloquence and without any exhaustion. You see me keep breaking to take a drink of water and cough, and none of this. He was on a roll. So the rebuttal came from the Ramanadis that I should say it didn't come. They were waiting for the rebuttal to come, but it never came. There was nothing for them to say. Baladeva Vidyabhusana just completely defeated their arguments. We've just given a small hint here of some of the points that were made, but he just went through every single one of them like this. So the king waited. All right, he's presented his point. What do you have to say? Utter silence. The Ramanadis had nothing to say. And their silence was the confirmation of Jai Singh's own opinion. So he delivered a very brief conclusion in a conclusive statement. And he said, the evidence supports that the Gaudiya legitimacy is not to be questioned. Hereafter, the Gaudiya shall be recognized and respected as an authorized religious sect. I therefore order the reuniting of Radha and Govinda. And Radharani was brought from the room she'd been kept in and put next to Govindaji on the altar. So, very, very wonderful way that it was established. Here we go. I am here. Very wonderful way that this was established. Now, after accepting the defeat, it mentions that the Ramanadi priests, they came before Baladeva Vidyabhusana and requested initiation from him. Baladeva Vidyabhusana, as we mentioned in the very beginning, was not one known for name and fame, not one desiring profit, distinction, adoration, followers. So he expressed to them, he said, I'm going to decline. He said, and the reason is that you are following one of the 4 authorized sampradayas, the Sri Sampradaya. It's a very highly respected sampradaya, and it's one of the foremost adherents to the philosophy of Dasya Ras, devotional service and servitude. Therefore, any loss of respect or interference with this sampradaya, I would consider that an offense on my part, and therefore he declined. So, wonderful, wonderful end to this conclusion and to this debate. We've only briefly touched on it here and tried to fit this into the time frame we have. Sometimes at the end of books or movies, you'll see different characters throughout the presentation, and at the end they say, and after this incident, here's what happened in their life. So, in conclusion, Baladeva Vidyabhusana returned to Vrindavan, and while in Vrindavan, he assumed the position of leadership for the Gaudiya Vaishnavas in Vrindavan at that time. He continued to write books. He's written long list of books. He remained very faithful to the service of Jiva Goswami and very devoted to the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. He produced commentaries on all the 10 main Upanishads and 9 different works on the teachings of the Vaishnavas of Vrindavan. He also wrote many original works on grammar, drama, philosophy, poetry, like this. He remains to this day to be one of the unquestioned authorities on Vaishnava theology. And today we are celebrating his departure of Baladeva Vidyabhusana. Now, with his victory over the Ramanadis, Jai Singh was very, very satisfied. And he found the synthesis that he was looking for in the Vaishnava religions. And, of course, Radha was reunited with Govindaji on the altar, as she is eternally with Govindaji. And Jai Singh dedicated himself to the service of Govinda and passed a long and productive life as the king a scholar and a great devotee of Govindaji. It was mentioned that in 1714 he moved Govinda to the Jai Nivas Gardens and installed him there in a beautiful garden house where he was worshipped for 21 years. And then after that, in 1935, he had a huge, grand temple built, which is the temple that Govindaji resides in now. And it's in the palace compound, a very beautiful place. So in this way, he took great service throughout his life to Govindaji and accepted the position of minister, not as the king, but of the minister in the court of Govindaji. Installed Govindaji as the king of Jaipur and put himself only as a minister. And from that time, the royal seal of his government read, Shri Govinda Dev Charana Savai Jai Singh Sharana, that Lord Govinda, at whose feet Jai Singh takes refuge. So there we have a little bit about the life of Baladeva Vidyabhusana, and somehow or another, by the anxious desire of so many of you out there, and by the mercy of Baladeva Vidyabhusana and Govindaji, we were able to continue all the way through without our batteries dying, which is what we were afraid of here. So let me just look real quick at the chat room. Bhakti Carol's asking, when I was initiated. Well, we're talking about Govinda Baladeva Vidyabhusana, but anyway, I was initiated in 1973 by Srila Prabhupada. Manjesh is inquiring that I mentioned Baladeva Vidyabhusana was a young man when he entered Jaipur, but couldn't catch how young he was. Yeah, I didn't actually mention exactly how young he is. One of the things historically about Baladeva Vidyabhusana is there's not a lot known about the exact ages of his life at these different points because his birth time is not exactly known. As we found with many of the acharyas we've discussed in this series over the last 2.5 years, some of them we have exact details about, and some of them we don't have so much information about. And of course, it's mentioned right off that we don't have much information about Baladeva Vidyabhusana. So we're going to finish here. We have a bare 10% of energy left on our computer connection here tonight. And before we get taken off the air most brutally, we're going to finish with great appreciation for all of you joining us tonight. I see throughout the broadcast we had a few new people. Dhruv Maharaj Prabhu dropped in. Radhakrishna Devi Dasi from Montreal. Adi came in. Manjesh was, of course, always there with us. Bliss popped in. Tulsa Time is there. We want to thank all of you very much and remind you that our broadcast is every other Monday, every 2 weeks, and we invite you to join us again in 2 weeks on Monday night for another episode in the lives of the Vaishnavacharyas. I'm your host, Chaturatma Das, saying good night and Haribol.